Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. Back with our new Read Aloud Ranger in Time. And where we left off yesterday, Leo was out and letting the animals free. And when he looked out the window in the house when he was rescuing the cat, he saw that there were two warplanes and they were headed straight for the house that he was in. So we're on chapter 3, and it's called Race to the Waves. Race you to the water, Luke called across the beach to Sadie, who was working on a sand castle. No fair, you have a head start, Sadie shouted. She jumped to her feet and ran after him, splashing into the lake. Come swim with us, Ranger. Ranger looked up from the hole he was digging in the sand. Lakeshore holes were the very best kind to dig. The wet sand was soft, and no one yelled at him about messing up the garden, but the water looked like fun, too. Ranger backed out of his hole and started toward the waves, but then a white and gray bird caught his eye. Seagull? Ranger barked and ran toward it. The seagull started running, too. Ranger ran faster. He almost caught up when the bird unfolded its wings and flew away over the sand. Ranger barked once more. Then he headed for the water to join Luke and Sadie. Nice try, Ranger, Luke said as Ranger splashed up to him, but birds are even harder to catch than squirrels, flying and all. He gave Ranger a damp pat on the head. Ranger knew about birds and flying. He loved chasing seagulls anyway, just like how he loved chasing squirrels at home. That was the reason he was playing at the beach today, and not off on an official search and rescue mission somewhere else. Zoom picture. Here's Ranger trying to get that seagull. Ranger had done all kinds of search and rescue dog trainings with Luke and his dad. He learned to track missing people by following the scent trails they left behind. He'd learned how to search for people who were hurt and fallen down buildings and how to bring back help. But in order to be an official search and rescue dog, you had to pass a special test. You had to follow a scent and ignore everything else in your path, even hot dogs, even squirrels. Ranger had managed to trot past the hot dog on his test day, but when the twitchy-tailed squirrel ran across the field, he'd taken off chasing it. Ranger knew there wasn't a real person in trouble that day. It was just practice again. If a real person needed help, Ranger would have left the squirrel alone and helped. But that didn't matter. Ranger didn't pass his test, so here he was at the beach, and that was fine. Ranger loved the beach. He splashed around with Sadie and Luke and curled up in the sun until it was time to go home. When the car pulled into the driveway, Ranger followed everyone into the house. He stopped in the mudroom to get a drink from his water dish, but it was empty. Ranger barked, and Luke came and took his dish away to fill it. But before Luke came back, Ranger heard a familiar sound coming from his dog bed. Ranger nuzzled his blanket aside until he found the old first aid kit he dug up from the garden one day. It was humming quietly. Something had happened every once in a while when someone far away was in trouble. The last time the old metal box hummed, it had taken Ranger to a trembling place where a girl named Lily needed help. The time before that, Ranger had found himself in the middle of a rainstorm with a girl named Helga in a land of smoke and ash. Before that, the old box had brought him to a ship bound for the South Pole, where a boy named Jack had started a dangerous journey. Ranger looked up. On the wall over his dog bed was a drawing Jack made of him. Ranger pawed at his blanket some more and uncovered a bright yellow feather, a gift of thanks from Lily after he'd helped her escape from a great earthquake and fire. Now the first aid kit was humming again. Ranger nuzzled his old leather strap over his neck. He whined as the humming buzzed louder. The box grew warm at his neck, and light shone off from the cracks. It got brighter and brighter until Ranger couldn't see his dog bed or the mudroom anymore. Too bright! He had to close his eyes, and the skin on his neck prickled. He felt as if he was being squeezed through a hole in the sky. Finally, the humming stopped. There was a quick half a second of quiet before the air exploded with booms and blasts and splashes. Deep voices cried out. Ranger opened his eyes. Sand sprayed into them. Something whistled past his ear with a sharp zing. Ranger's paws sank into the wet sand. He was on a beach, but there was no time to guess where or why. He wasn't home, and he wasn't safe. No one was. Men ran everywhere, shouting, stumbling, falling to the sand. Those who stayed on their feet were all running away from the waves toward a shallow, rocky ditch. Ranger raced after them. So he must be where D-Day is happening. Chapter 4, Chaos in Sand. Ranger leaped into the ditch. He skidded down loose rocks and nearly landed on one of the men, a tall, skinny soldier with dark brown hair and dark brown skin. The young man's green-brown clothes had packed drip with seawater as he crouched, trying to catch his breath. "We brought dogs in the first wave of boats?" he called to another man. The other man shrugged and wiped blood from his cheek. "Guess so. Probably for the landmines. Captain said the whole beach up there is loaded. You have dry ammo, Walt?" The man called Walt nodded and handed the other man a small box. While the other man loaded his gun, Walt reached for the first aid kit around Ranger's neck. Ranger watched as he opened the box and shook his head at the little collection of bandages and gauze inside. "Afraid we'll need more than this today," Walt said. He closed the box and tucked it away beside some other supplies. Ranger shook the rain from his fur and looked around. Everywhere, soldiers were running, following, stumbling into the ditch, out of breath, while the air seemed to explode around them. Where was he? And how was he supposed to help these wet, frightening men? Ranger walked along the ditch, slipping through the chaotic crowd. Men shouted over the noise to one another. Some rummaged through their packs, reloading guns. So here's Ranger, and that soldier is checking out what he has in his first aid kit. One was curled up against the rocks, knees to his chest, with his eyes squeezed shut. More and more men spilled into the ditch until there was no more room at all. Gunfire rattled over their heads. Something exploded nearby and sent another blast of sand spraying into Ranger's eyes. "We've got to get off this beach," one of the men shouted. "Come on!" "Ready?" Someone else yelled. "Go!" The men at the far end of the ditch scrambled out onto the sand and started running. Ranger climbed up a bit to see where they were headed. Something whistled past his ear and he fell back. He couldn't tell where the men were going, but in that split second above the sand, he'd seen enough to know that they weren't safe. Dark smoke filled the air. Soldiers raced up the beach, dodging jagged pieces of metal that jutted up from the sand. They jumped over nests of sharp, snarled wires. Everywhere, men were falling. And the noise? Booms and blasts shook the sky. It was even louder than the fireworks at home that made Ranger duck under Luke's bed. Here, there was no place to hide. How was Ranger supposed to help? His other journeys hadn't prepared him for the chaos of this terrifying beach. In all the times his first aid kit had hummed, all the times it had taken him far away to help someone in trouble, he'd never seen anything like this. "Look out! Make room!" Two more men come tumbling into the ditch, dripping wet, hugging their guns to their chests. "Where's Jackson?" one of them said. "He was right behind me on the ramp." The other man shook his head. "They let us out too deep. We must have lost half a dozen men as soon as they hit the water." "We have to go back," someone shouted. Ranger looked up. It was Walt, the tall, skinny man he'd seen earlier. "Come on!" Walt crept to the edge of the ditch and looked over the rim. Something exploded, and pieces of metal came showering into the ditch. "Get down, Walt! We can't go back! We'll never make it!" One of the other men shouted. Ranger pawed at the Walt man's pant leg to get him to come back down where it was safer, but Walt hoisted himself up. He left his gun in the ditch and ran back toward the churning ocean. Ranger felt an unmistakable tug to follow. Even though the air still boomed with fire gun, he jumped out of the ditch, paws slipping on the wet sand, and ran after Walt. We will be back tomorrow to continue with Ranger in Time. The next chapter is called The Rescue from the Sea. So maybe Rescue in this new character, Walt, will save some people. Have a great Wednesday.